welcome to everybody joining us today at this webinar. I would also like to take this opportunity to give my respects to the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are all participating in this webinar today. The local government elections 2021 are one of the biggest events to be held in New South Wales this year. It involves more than 5 million electors, more than 200 pre-poll venues, over 2,000 polling places, and the engagement of an additional 20,000 people from the communities, your communities, to assist us in delivering these elections. As I said, this is likely to be the largest event to be held in 2021 in New South Wales. And in the current circumstances in which we all live, it's also an election which we are determined to hold in a COVID-safe manner. The purpose of these candidate webinars is to help political parties, candidates and scrutineers to participate more fully in this important event. We will give an overview during the webinars of the process and procedures for nominating and campaigning, and compliance obligations surrounding election funding. But having said that, I must stress that these webinars are provided to give guidance and awareness only. Each of you have your own individual circumstances, and we are not giving legal advice in relation to those circumstances. If you have a matter where you believe it raises in matters of interpretation of the legislation and your own legal circumstances, please obtain your own independent legal advice. Our aim is to deliver these elections with transparency, fairness, and in the current climate, a safe, healthy environment for you and the people of New South Wales to exercise their democratic rights. So again, welcome, and I'll now pass you back for the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Good evening everyone, my name is Felicity. I work at the New South Wales Electoral Commission and I'll be hosting tonight's webinar. I'd first like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and we celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Tonight I'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and we're using Slido as our platform for question asking. So please use your mobile device to go to slido.com, and the hashtag for the webinar tonight is LG21elections, and once you've entered that hashtag you'll be able to answer or ask all the questions that you have for me tonight about the topics that I'm covering, or any other question you might have about the local government elections. So please ask your questions as I'm discussing particular topics, because I will be answering questions about those topics as and when I discuss them. I might not be able to answer all of the questions depending on how many questions come through, and if you are asking particular questions that are quite specific to your circumstances, if I feel like they don't apply to the majority of people who are tuned in tonight, I might not answer the questions. But certainly after tonight's webinar, we'll be putting on our website a list of all the questions that have been asked, with written answers to all of them. So if I don't get to answer them tonight, we will put something on the website there for you. We do have some questions already, and just in case you've got some technical difficulties at your end, just send an SMS through to 0408 039 679. We've got some people on standby who'll be able to attend to any technical issues you've got. If you're having some lagging issues with your internet connection at your end, we will be recording this webinar and putting the recording up on our website in the coming days, so you can tune in to the recording at a later date if it's not working for you tonight. So I'd just like to recap what we covered off at the previous webinars, which were held in the last week of April. And there were 2 webinars, one during the day, one in the evening. They covered the same content. And if you missed those, you can go onto our website and look at a recording of those webinars. They covered off the changes to the Local Government Act since the last local government elections. They also discussed the enrolment procedures and authorised roles for the upcoming elections, a high-level overview of the candidate nomination process, and also discussed the ballot papers and the ballot paper draws at a very high level. So again, just go onto our website if you miss those, and you can watch the recordings in your own time. And just a reminder as well that our webinars aren't legal advice. The New South Wales Electoral Commission can't give parties and candidates legal advice, and it's up to all electoral participants to make sure that they're complying with the law and reading the information available on our website and looking at the legislation to understand how the laws apply to them. And today's webinar is based on the Electoral Funding Act 2018, which you can access from the New South Wales Legislation website. So some really significant changes occurred to the electoral funding laws since the last local government elections, and it's important that parties and candidates understand what those changes were, because in some cases it makes things much easier for you in running your campaigns, and there are some new rules that you need to comply with as well. So firstly, there's now a ban on cash donations over $100. I will talk about this further in the webinar, but essentially if you're receiving monetary donations, if they're valued at over $100, they need to be made electronically or by cheque. There are now caps on electoral expenditure, so for some of you who have been engaged in state elections in the past, you might be familiar with the caps on electoral expenditure. So caps now also apply to local government elections, and I will be talking about the cap rules a little later. Candidates and groups no longer have to have an official agent. So in past elections, candidates and groups had an official agent who would be the person responsible for managing and disclosing the candidates' political donations and electoral expenditure. Now candidates are responsible for managing and disclosing their own donations and electoral expenditure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that the reporting periods and the due dates for submitting disclosures have changed. In particular, political donation disclosures are now submitted more frequently, and there is a shorter time period to submit those disclosures. I'll give you further details later. Disclosure forms no longer need to be signed by a registered company auditor. So I know some of you at past elections would have found this quite a costly exercise to have your disclosures signed by a company auditor. You no longer need to do that. Political parties still need to have their accounts audited, but candidates and groups and parties for disclosure purposes don't have to have their forms signed by an auditor. And we now also have the online publication of registers. So I'll talk a little bit about the registration of candidates and groups and the public registers that we keep. And in the past, those registers, if people wanted to come and have a look and see who was registered for an election, they would have to have come into our office to look at a paper copy of the register. But now we publish those registers on our website, so they're accessible to anyone to have a look at. So one of the things I wanted to announce tonight is a new platform that we're launching in June, which is called Funding and Disclosure Online. And Funding and Disclosure Online is a secure, convenient and accessible portal which is available to parties, groups, candidates, political donors, third-party campaigners from June. And it's a way for electoral participants to engage with us online by submitting forms electronically rather than downloading PDF forms from our website and filling them in, hand signing them, and then faxing them or emailing them to us. So Funding and Disclosure Online starts in June. There'll be links on our website for people to click on so that they can set up their access and then start using the portal. Candidates and groups can apply to be registered using the portal. if you're already registered, or if you register from June, you can update your registered details in the portal. You can enter the details of political donations and electoral expenditure as and when they occur. So you don't have to wait until the end of a reporting period to start entering your donations and expenditure into a disclosure form. You can start entering them into the online form as and when they occur, and then during the official lodgement period you can submit that form and e-sign it through the portal and send it to us electronically. So we're hoping this is going to be a much more streamlined and efficient way for parties and groups and candidates to do what they need to do for electoral funding and disclosure purposes. And we'll be putting a lot of information on our website in June, user guides, videos, lots of how-tos, step-by-step instructions on how to do all the things that you can do in funding and disclosure online. And over the coming year, the functionality in the system will expand as well as we build functionality for different sorts of things in the portal to include, say, registration for third-party campaigners and public funding claims and things like that. For now though, the PDF forms will still be available on our website. So if you're not comfortable using funding and disclosure online, or you want to read a bit more about it first before you set up your account, you still can use the PDF forms on our website under the Forms section. So let's now talk about candidate and group registration. And for those of you that have been candidates before, this may be a familiar thing to you, but if you're a first-time candidate, this could be new. So candidates and groups must be registered for electoral funding purposes before accepting any political donations or making payments for any electoral expenditure. If you're a current councillor or mayor, you don't need to be registered, but you can apply to be registered if you want to. And the registration period is now open and closes on Wednesday the 4th of August, which is actually the same day that candidate nominations close as well. So registration forms are currently on our website. You can register now if you want to accept political donations or pay for your electoral expenditure. And just be mindful though that if you do register before 1 July, you will need to submit disclosure forms for the current financial year, which will be due in July and September this year. So if you are accepting donations, if you are paying for expenditure, you do need to be registered, and you need to do that now. But if you don't need to register until 1 July, you can hold off if you won't be accepting donations or paying for your expenses until then, and that will mean you don't start having to submit disclosures until for the next financial year. So what's the difference between being registered for the election and being nominated? Lots of candidates ask us this question, so it's good to clear it up if people might be a little bit confused about the two different processes. And they are two separate processes and they serve two different purposes. So being nominated as a candidate means that your name will be included on the ballot paper and that voters can then vote for you on election day or in the early voting period. So you have to be nominated as a candidate to have your name on the ballot paper, and you can only be nominated during the official nomination period, which takes place in July. If you want to form a group on the ballot paper, then you must also, during the official nomination period, request to form a group on the ballot paper. Being registered for electoral funding purposes means that you can accept political donations and pay for your electoral expenditure. So being registered is around your regulatory requirements for your campaign finances. It's not connected to being nominated. If you're registered and you aren't nominated, your name won't be on the ballot paper. Likewise, if you're nominated, you can't accept donations or incur expenditure until you're nominated. So candidates and groups that aren't registered, and you don't have to be registered if you're not going to accept donations or pay for your electoral expenditure, you don't have to apply to be registered. And if that's you, then you will be automatically registered on the day For most people, it's going to be the day after nominations close, which will be Thursday, the 5th of August. It's the day that the ballot paper draw occurs in your council area. So just be mindful, if you don't apply to be registered before you're nominated, you are registered on the day that the ballot paper draw takes place. And from that day, all candidates and groups in the local government area can lawfully accept donations and pay for their electoral expenditure. So how do you apply to be registered? Well, we have two forms on our website. One is for candidates, the EF729, and the other is for groups, the EF732. If you are going to be in a group and at least 2 group members are already known, you can complete the group registration form. You don't have to know who all of your group members are at the time. As long as 2 group members are known, you can register the group and you can register those candidates in the group using that form. If you're not going to be in a group, or if you're not sure you're going to be in a group but you want to be registered, you can use the form EF729, that's to register you as a candidate. If you're registered as a group and new candidates join your group, those candidates have to be registered to join your group. So those candidates can fill in the candidate registration form EF729, indicate on that form that they're affiliated with the group, and then the group, the lead candidate of the group can notify us that yes, that candidate has now joined the group. Now, if you're applying to be registered from June onwards, you can use Funding and Disclosure Online, or you can use the PDF forms on our website. And when we receive either your submission through Funding and Disclosure Online, or we receive your PDF form via email or post or fax, we'll get in contact with you to let you know we've received it and that we've processed it, and we'll confirm your registration. And so once you receive that confirmation, you can be sure that we're saying to you that you can lawfully start accepting donations and paying for your electoral expenditure. So as I mentioned just before, the public register of candidates we now publish on our website, and it's a big forward step for accessibility so that people don't have to come into our office to look at the register. You can now access it from wherever you are, as long as you've got internet access. So we do have a question here, which I will deal with now, and that is there any way to get in contact with other potential candidates easily? Well, if you're talking about candidates who are already registered, you can go on to the list of registered candidates and see who is registered in your local government area or ward. We don't put candidates' addresses or contact details on the register, but those people, their names are listed. When the nomination period starts, the details of nominated candidates will be put up on the website as well, and they will include further contact details for candidates, so you can get in touch with candidates at that point too. But I think if you're wanting to form a group, it's really just a matter of you doing the hard work to go out and find people who are enrolled to vote in the council area that are happy to form a group with you. Now, just an important thing I must note here around once you're registered as a candidate or group, if your registered details change, your name, your address, the council or ward that you're going to be a candidate or group in, the composition of your group, if a candidate leaves the group or joins the group, we have to be notified of all of those changes within 30 days. Now you can use the form EF740, which is on our website, download that form and provide the details of what registered details have changed. Or from June you can use Funding and Disclosure Online to update those details. And you can use Funding and Disclosure Online even if you were registered using a paper form. Once you've registered, we put your details in the system which is linked to Funding and Disclosure Online, so you can subsequently go in, set up your access to Funding and Disclosure Online and update your registered details online with us rather than filling in the paper form. So now a big chunk of tonight's webinar is all about managing and disclosing political donations and electoral expenditure. So we're going to cover off accepting political donations, who can you accept donations from, how much can you accept, prohibited donors, caps on donations, all of those sorts of things. Incurring electoral expenditure, so what is electoral expenditure, what are the caps on electoral expenditure. Operating a campaign account, when do I need to open a campaign account, how do I use it, what money can I put into it, what payments do I have to make out of it. How to keep complete and accurate records of your donations and expenditure, and how and when to disclose those donations and expenditure. So one of the big things that has changed since the last elections for local government is that the person responsible for managing and disclosing political donations and electoral expenditure has changed. As I said earlier, in the past, candidates and groups had to have an official agent, which was a separate person who would be managing the donations and expenditure, operating a campaign account and making disclosures. Now, if you're a candidate, including a candidate in a group, you're responsible for managing and disclosing your own political donations and electoral expenditure. So just be mindful, if you are in a group, you will have to make your own disclosures, and if you accept a certain amount in donations or spend a certain amount in electoral expenditure, you will have to have your own campaign account. Also, the lead candidate of each group is responsible for managing and disclosing the group's political donations and electoral expenditure. So the lead candidate will do their own separate candidate disclosures plus disclosures for the group as an entity. And the political donations and electoral expenditure of a group have to be managed separately and disclosed separately from any donations and expenditure of each group member. So we do have a question about official agents, and that is that, does this mean that I don't need to print information of an official agent on any of my publications? So I think this question's around, what do you need to put down as the authorisation for the authorisation details on your electoral material? And there are rules about what you have to put down, who you have to put down for your authorisation details and printer details on your electoral material. In our webinar in June, there will be a lot of content that covers off the rules around electoral material. And so tune into the webinars in June. There'll also be a detailed webinar closer to the election about registering electoral material that you want to hand out on election day. So a lot of that question will be answered in full in the June webinars. So let's talk about campaign accounts, which can be quite a complex area for candidates and groups. So I'll try and cover it off as plainly and as simply as I can. So a candidate or group has to open a campaign account before accepting $1,000 or more in political donations and before incurring $1,000 or more in electoral expenditure. So if your donations and expenditure are going to be below the $1,000 threshold amount, you don't need to have a campaign account, but you still need to record your political donations and record your electoral expenditure, and they still need to be disclosed. But if you do satisfy the $1,000 threshold amount for a campaign account, you must open one with a financial institution. So if a candidate is accepting $1,000 or more in donations or incurring $1,000 or more in electoral expenditure, must open a campaign account, and they must be a signatory on that account. And the same goes for a group. So if a group is going to incur $1,000 or more in electoral expenditure or accept $1,000 or more in political donations, then the lead candidate of the group must open a campaign account for the group and must be a signatory on that account. If there are groups running across wards in a council area that are aligned somewhat, they might be endorsed by the same political party, for example, the rule applies separately to each group in each ward. So the lead candidate of each group, of the group in Ward A, would need to open a campaign account. The group in Ward B would, if they meet the $1,000 threshold amount, would need to open a separate campaign account there. And these campaign accounts have to be separate to any account held by a political party. So we do have a question around lead candidates. How do you qualify as a lead candidate? So when I say lead candidate, I mean the person who is named at the top of the list of candidates when the group applies to be registered. And usually that person is also going to be the same person who is at the top of the list of candidates in the group on the ballot paper. That's what we call the lead candidate. And it's up to each group to decide, I should say, who the lead candidate of their group is. So can a campaign account that was used at a past election be reused at this election? And I think we've got a question about this. Can I use an existing bank account as an election campaign account? You have to use an account that's separate to the other accounts you hold. And if you have a campaign account that you've used at a past election, it can be reused. But if you have funds left over in that account from the past election, those funds have to be dealt with and disbursed in accordance with the rules. And we do have information on our website about how to disburse those funds. So you can have a look first on our website, and then if you've got further questions, you can make contact with us and ask us questions to clarify how those funds need to be disbursed. But you can't actually use funds left over from a past election for the current election. They have to be disbursed properly, and you start basically from a nil balance. So the campaign account must be used to pay for electoral expenditure. So all electoral expenditure, except for some minor payments, which I'll talk about in a minute, have to be paid from the campaign account. And if you're accepting political donations that are going to be used to pay for that electoral expenditure, then you need to deposit those political donations into the campaign account. Now, minor payments of $50 or less, or totalling $1,000 in the election period or less, can be paid outside of the campaign account. So that means if you're down at the local stationery shop and you need to pick up some things, stationery, pens, paper, printing paper, for example, small amounts, they can be paid for outside of the campaign account. So we do have a question about the name of the account. So does an account need to have a group name, or could it be under the lead candidate's name only? Look, the legislation doesn't specify anything about the name of an account. It's really a matter for the lead candidate or the candidate to talk to the financial institution, and certain banks might have certain rules about what the account is called, but there's nothing under the electoral funding legislation that specifies what the account should be called. As long as the lead candidate of a group is authorised with a financial institution to operate the account, that's the main thing. So can a candidate pay their own funds into their candidate campaign account? Yes, they can. Candidates who have their own candidate campaign account can put their own funds into that account and then use those funds to pay for their own electoral expenditure as a candidate. Those payments into the account have to be disclosed by the candidate in the half-yearly political donation disclosure form, but yes, that can be done. And a candidate who is a member of a group, can they pay their own funds into the group's campaign account? Yes, they can, but technically group members contributing to the group's campaign are paying political donations from themselves to their group. So the donation rules apply, the rules around the caps on political donations apply. So if you are a group member and you want to contribute your own funds to the group's campaign, you need to be mindful that you need to comply with the political donation rules. We do have a question here around contributions made by candidates. Are self-donations recorded as if they were from another party? So in your record keeping, if you're contributing your own funds into your own candidate campaign account, you can record how much you deposited into the account and when. That will come up on your bank statements as well. When you disclose that, there's a particular section on the political donation disclosure form. It's called something along the lines of contributions made by candidates into their campaign account. And you basically just record and disclose there the date of each payment, the amount, and any terms or conditions on those payments. For example, that you're going to reimburse yourself if you receive donations, you'll reimburse yourself the money that you put in. Each party must use, political party accounts, so each party must use an account to pay for the party's electoral expenditure at local government elections. The political party accounts have to be separate to the candidate and group accounts. And there are certain restrictions on what parties can put into the account in terms of donations, borrowed funds, and any funds they had as at the 1st of July 2016, there are rules around that. So if you're a political party and you're unsure about those rules, have a look on our website in the first instance and then contact us if you've got further questions. So just to sum up on the campaign accounts, the rules around the campaign accounts can be quite complex, and I understand that many of you will have certain scenarios that you might have questions about that are particular to you. You might have a mayoral candidate in your group. You might have groups running across a number of wards where you are all, say, endorsed by the same party, and how do you work your campaign accounts. So they can be quite complex, and I'm not going to go into all the rules tonight, but check out our website. We will be putting some more information on our website over the coming weeks just to outline some different scenarios and what you need to do if you fit within those scenarios. And of course, contact us if you have questions. So let's now move on to political donations. So donations are a gift, essentially, a gift. This is where someone gives something to you. It could be a monetary gift or a non-monetary gift, and they're giving it to you without you giving the equivalent value back to them. So in terms of a gift made to a candidate, it has to be a gift that's used for an election, or if the candidate's a current councillor or mayor, a gift that is for the elected member's duties as an elected member, or it could be a gift that entitles you to make a political donation to somebody else, or it could be a gift that reimburses you for electoral expenditure that you've incurred. Examples of donations, so we've got monetary donations, money, which includes electronic payments, cheques, cash, and don't forget there's a ban on cash donations over $100. Donations also include free and discounted goods and services, so things like if you go to your local printer and the printer says to you, well, normally I charge people $1,000 for this much printing, but for you I'll give it to you for $500. The difference, the discount that you've been given there is a political donation. It must be accounted for and disclosed. So we do have a question just around donations and people who own their own business, and this might be something that comes up for quite a few candidates actually. Can I use my business to develop designs, website and marketing? So if you own your own business and your business is providing you services as a candidate through designs, website, marketing, that is essentially a gift from your business to yourself. So that needs to be valued and it needs to be properly accounted for as a political donation. Candidates can't just use their businesses to produce electoral material, get their businesses to design their electoral material and not have that accounted for. It must be properly accounted for and disclosed. So non-monetary gifts, some people might be holding fundraising auctions, people might give you things to auction off at those auctions, say some sporting memorabilia for example. If you're given a non-monetary gift, that has to be properly valued and disclosed, and all the donation rules apply to it. And we do have a question around in-kind donations. How do you report in-kind donations? So you just report them as you would monetary donations on the disclosure form. You disclose the date that the donation was made, the name of the donor. So if it was your business, for example, it would be the business name, the ABN, if the donor is an entity, the address of the donor, the amount of the donation or the value of it if it's an in-kind gift. And there's a couple of other things you need to disclose as well. If you have a look at the disclosure forms currently on our website, you'll see the different things that need to be disclosed for donations. But there's no difference between disclosing in-kind gifts and monetary donations. Also, if you're selling tickets or other items for a fundraising event, the sale of those tickets are political donations. Auctions that you might have at a fundraiser, the sale price for those auction items, they are political donations. Any gifts that are given that you auction off, as I said, are donations. They need to be accounted for and disclosed. If you're a member of a political party and you pay membership fees to that political party, those membership fees are political donations, so you need to disclose making those donations to the party. On the political donation disclosure form, there's a section for donations that you've received and donations that you've made. So under the donations that you've made section, you would disclose the political donations you've made in the form of party membership fees or other donations you've made to candidates and groups or whoever. Also, a form of donation is uncharged interest or insufficient interest on loans. I'll talk about loans in a little while. There are some rules around charging interest on loans, and if you charge insufficient interest, or if the lender charges you insufficient interest, that would need to be accounted for as a donation. So any transfers of funds between parties, groups, candidates, elected members, they're all donations. Transfers between party branches, they're political donations, and transfers between different parties are donations. There's two categories of donations. We've got small donations, they're single donations of $1,000 or less, and also multiple donations made by the same donor in a financial year that in aggregate are $1,000 or less. Now, for all of your small donations that you receive, you need to record the details of each donor because you must know who your donors are and make sure they're lawful donors, and you must record the donations. And when it comes time to disclose, you simply disclose the total number of small donations you received in the period and the total value. The second category of donations is reportable political donations, and they are single donations of $1,000 or more, or multiple donations made by the same donor to the same recipient in a financial year that in total are $1,000 or more. Now, for all of your reportable political donations, you need to record the details of each donor and the donation, and you have to issue a receipt for the monetary donations and issue a written acknowledgement for any non-monetary gifts. And the receipt and acknowledgement has to be written using a New South Wales Electoral Commission receipt book, and if you don't have one, you can contact us and we'll send one to you. If my family, we have a question here, if my family hand out flyers, do I have to declare their time? So if you've got people that are doing volunteer work for you, volunteers are not making political donations, so you don't need to disclose the time that your family members are spending handing out flyers for you. But just be careful around this area. If you have people working in a professional capacity in their ordinary lives, say they might be a lawyer, and you go to them and ask for some free legal advice, even if they're your brother or sister or whoever, a close friend, if they're providing their professional services to you at a free or discounted rate, that needs to be properly accounted for and disclosed as a donation. So the caps on donations, there are caps on political donations. They've been around now for a number of years, and this means that you can only accept a certain amount from each donor in a financial year. The cap amounts are published on our website, and I've also got them listed there in the table on the screen. And just be mindful that it's an offence to accept a political donation over the applicable cap. Now the caps are adjusted each financial year, and you can see in the table there that I have the amounts for the current financial year and I have the amounts for next financial year. The amounts for next financial year are yet to be approved, but I can tell you for a registered party and group, they will go from $6,600 to $6,700, and for an unregistered party, candidate, elected member, third party campaigner or an associated entity, the cap amount goes from $3,000 to $3,100 next financial year. So a reminder too that contributions made by candidates to finance their own election campaign are not political donations, so they're not subject to the donation caps. You can contribute as much as you like to your own candidate campaign, and you're really only limited then by the amount of money you can spend and keep within the expenditure caps. So contributions made by candidates for their own campaign are not donations, not subject to the caps. Again, if you're in a group and you want to contribute your own funds to the group's campaign, that's a political donation from you to your group, and you need to comply with the cap amounts. So this financial year, a group member could donate up to $6,600 to their group, and then next financial year donate up to $6,700 to their group. But they are donations, they need to be accounted for, and all of the rules that apply to donations apply in those cases. There are some aggregation rules. You might think, what's an aggregation rule? Oh my goodness. Let's cover some of those off now. Multiple donations accepted from a donor by the same recipient. So this is where a donor is giving you more than one donation in a financial year. You need to add those up, and in total, those donations from that donor to you have to be within your applicable cap. Okay, so here's an example. The donor makes a $2,000 donation to a candidate on the 20th of May. The candidate donation cap for the current year is $3,000, so the candidate can only accept up to $1,000 from the donor for the remainder of the financial year. The next aggregation rule is around candidates, groups and elected members of the same party. So if you're endorsed by the same party, if there is a donor that is making donations to candidates, groups and elected members of the same party, then the aggregate amount that the candidates, groups and elected members endorsed by that party can accept from that donor in the financial year have to be within the donation cap for the group. So that's $6,600 currently, $6,700 next financial year. Here's an example. The donor makes a $2,000 donation to a candidate endorsed by a party on the 20th of May, and another candidate endorsed by the same party in a different local government area accepts a donation from the same donor on the 15th of June. In this case, the second candidate can only accept up to $1,000 from the donor in the financial year. And this rule applies across all council areas and wards in New South Wales that are having an election. So we do have a question around the caps and how much a candidate can donate to their party. How much can a candidate give to a political party for their campaign? Well, for local government elections, if a candidate gives money to their party, that's a donation from the candidate to their party, which means that currently, in the current financial year, the candidate can give $6,600 to their party, and then next financial year, $6,700 to their party. So let's just move quickly on to loans. So candidates, groups, parties can accept loans. They can be from financial institutions or from anybody else who is not a prohibited donor. And if you're accepting a reportable loan, which is a loan of $1,000, or multiple loans made by the same lender in the financial year to the same loan recipient, that in total are $1,000 or more, reportable loans have to be properly recorded and have to be disclosed. Now, earlier I mentioned that uncharged or insufficient interest on a loan is a donation, and it must be disclosed. And on our website, we've got the rates set by the New South Wales Electoral Commission for secured and unsecured loans. And at the moment, there's 6.45% per annum for secured loans and 12.7% per annum for unsecured loans. And any interest charged below these amounts needs to be properly accounted for and disclosed as a political donation. So here's an example. If there's an unsecured loan of $5,000 and the interest charged is 5%, this means that 7.7% of the loan, or $385, is a political donation from the lender to the loan recipient. And because it's a donation, that means the donation must be within the donation caps, and the lender must comply with the rules around who can make political donations. So who can you accept a political donation from? And of course, just going back to what we talked about earlier about being registered for the election, it's an offence to accept a political donation without being registered. So a candidate or group first has to be registered before they accept political donations. And you can only accept political donations from lawful donors, and they are people who are on the electoral roll, and it doesn't have to be just the electoral roll in New South Wales, they can be enrolled anywhere in Australia. Or if the donor is an entity, it has to have an ABN or other business number that's recognised by ASIC. And if neither of those two apply, then the prospective donor can apply to the New South Wales Electoral Commission to be approved to make political donations. They'd have to provide certain identification, and then we can deal with that application and notify the prospective donor as to whether or not they're approved to make donations. But essentially, they're the three categories of people and entities you can accept donations from. Prohibited donors. So many of you will be aware of the prohibited donor laws. They've been in place for a number of years. It's unlawful to accept a donation from a prohibited donor. It's unlawful for a prohibited donor to make a political donation. It's unlawful to solicit a donation from a prohibited donor. A prohibited donor can't make a donation to someone and then pass it on to a candidate or group. All of those things are offences under the electoral funding laws. And prohibited donors are property developers and corporations in the liquor, gambling and tobacco industries. They also include industry representative organisations where the members of those organisations are property developers, liquor, gambling or tobacco entities. So just be mindful when you're accepting donations that you're confirming with donors these rules about who can make donations, who you can accept donations from, to make sure that you're complying with these rules. The prohibited donors also include what we call close associates, which can be a little bit ambiguous for people. What does a close associate mean? It basically means that if someone's a director of a corporation that's a property developer or liquor, gambling or tobacco entity, or a spouse of the director, or a related body corporate of a corporation that's a prohibited donor, they're all close associates, which means those people can't make donations either, and you can't accept donations from them. So I'll just cover off the other types of unlawful donations. We have talked about the ban on cash donations over $100. Cash donations or monetary donations over this amount have to be made electronically or by cheque. Just be mindful of this when you're having your fundraisers. If you're collecting funds, donations through the night of a fundraiser, you need to be mindful of this rule. Reportable political donations, so they're the ones $1,000 or more. It's unlawful to accept anonymous reportable political donations, so make sure the donors are giving you their names and addresses. And if you've got doubts about the accuracy or the truthfulness of what the donor is telling you, you shouldn't be accepting that donation. So make sure you're getting proper details from your donors about who they are. If you're an endorsed elected member or candidate, or you're from a political party, it's unlawful for you to donate to independent candidates and groups. So that's something to be mindful of as well, particularly at local government elections where some people who might be members of political parties are running as independents. Endorsed candidates and parties cannot donate to independents at the elections. Unrecorded reportable loans, they're unlawful as well. As I said before, loans of $1,000 or more, you must record the details of those loans. And indirect campaign contributions, which are like in-kind gifts, they can be accepted, but they're subject to certain threshold amounts, and I'll talk about those shortly. So indirect campaign contributions. There's 3 categories of what could be an indirect campaign contribution. The main one is around free or discounted, say, office accommodation, vehicles, computers, office equipment that's used for an election campaign. This is where some candidates might find this a little bit complex if they're using their business as say their campaign headquarters. As I said before, if you have a business and you're using your business to support your campaign, it has to be properly accounted for and disclosed and be within the applicable donation caps. The other categories of indirect campaign contributions are where you incur electoral expenditure but somebody else pays for it for you, or you incur electoral expenditure but someone waives that expenditure, says no, you don't need to pay me, or you can pay me a discounted rate. Those things are what we call indirect campaign contributions, and they're subject to limits which are actually the same as the donation cap amounts. So you need to properly value them and then make sure you're within the threshold amounts and properly disclose them as well. So as it just says there, the threshold amounts for indirect campaign contributions are the same as the donation cap amounts. So currently $6,600 for a registered party or group and $3,000 for an unregistered party, candidate, elected member, third party campaigner or associated entity. So unlawful indirect campaign contributions don't include volunteer labour, and I think I recall I responded to a question on that earlier, or the use of a volunteer's vehicle or equipment. And it also doesn't include anything that a party does for its endorsed candidates that the party agent arranges for the party and those candidates. So just to recap, what do we do when a political donation is received? And I've tried here to just list the different steps that you need to go through. So first of all, just remember that as a candidate or group, you have to be registered before accepting the donation. You have to obtain the name and address of the donor, and you have to check the donor is enrolled or has a business number or has been approved to make donations. So you need to do this for all your donations, not just your reportable donations, but also the small ones as well. You have to check that the donor and the donation is not unlawful. So is it compliant with the donation cap amounts? Is the donor a prohibited donor? If it's a indirect campaign contribution, is it within the threshold amounts for indirect campaign contributions? We have got a question here around donations, which I'll just address. If someone donates small amounts and it exceeds $1,000, at which point must the receipt be issued? When it's over $1,000, then every time after, or at the end? So a receipt has to be issued once the $1,000 threshold amount is met. Issue the receipt then, and then for any subsequent donation that donor makes to you in the financial year, you need to issue a receipt, even if it's a small amount. So issue a further receipt for anything over $1,000 from that point on. Just back to our list on the screen. After you've checked that the donor and the donation is not unlawful, just make sure you make a complete and accurate record of the donor and the donation, because it will need to be disclosed, and issue the donor with a receipt if the donation is reportable. You deposit the donation into the campaign account, and then you use that donation to pay for your electoral expenditure or other authorised purpose under the legislation. So let's talk now about electoral expenditure, and under this section we'll talk about the caps. So what is electoral expenditure? It's expenditure that promotes or opposes a party or candidate or influences the vote at an election. And it includes things like advertising, the production and distribution of electoral material, internet, telecommunications and postage, employment of staff, office accommodation of candidates and staff, travel and accommodation of candidates and staff, and campaign research, fundraising and auditing expenses. So the caps on electoral expenditure. So yes, the electoral expenditure that you incur is subject to an expenditure cap, and that's for expenditure incurred in what we call the capped expenditure period, which starts on the 1st of July and it ends on election day. So expenditure you incur in that period has to be within the expenditure cap that's applicable to you. And one thing to bear in mind around the caps on electoral expenditure, it's very, very important, I haven't got it on the screen though, is for the purposes of the caps, expenditure is taken to be incurred when the goods are provided or the services are delivered. So if you're producing electoral material now, if you're paying for your advertising now, that material and that advertising will be subject to the expenditure caps if the material is distributed after the 1st of July up to election day, and if that advertising is broadcast or published in the capped expenditure period from the 1st of July up to election day. So just be mindful, if you are paying for things now, you will need to disclose them in this financial year's electoral expenditure disclosure forms, but you also need to account for them in your records as being subject to your expenditure cap if they're being broadcast or published or distributed in the capped expenditure period. So we have got a question around this, and that is, I paid for a photo and poster preparation in December 2019, so a little while ago now, when the election was due to be held in September 2020. Do I need to declare this expense? So because that expense was incurred for disclosure purposes in the 2019-20 financial year, it should have been disclosed in the electoral expenditure disclosure form for the last financial year. If you haven't done that and you've submitted your disclosure already, your disclosure will need to be amended, so you'll need to do an amended disclosure to disclose that expense. So yes, it does need to be disclosed, but it should have been disclosed last year. And you need to keep a record of it because it will be subject to the expenditure cap if you display those posters from 1 July onwards. So the caps are based on the number of enrolled electors in each area and ward, and we have to determine what those number of enrolled electors are 12 months before the election. So we worked that out in September of last year, and we published them on our website. So when you go onto our website, there's a list of councils there under the expenditure cap section, and it has what the applicable expenditure caps for that particular council area and ward. Now, you might look at those number of enrolled electors that we've put on the website and think, oh, that's not quite what it is now, and that's because we had to use the number of enrolled electors as at September of last year. And of course, it's an offence to incur electoral expenditure that exceeds the applicable cap. So just be mindful that you're keeping track of the expenditure you incur when you're displaying your materials, when your advertising is being published or broadcast. All of those things, all that are being done from 1 July to election day, all are subject to the expenditure caps, even if you're paying for them now. What if you have expenses now prior to July 1? That's a question we've got here. You can incur expenditure now as long as you're registered. That's not a problem at all. You have to disclose them in this financial year's disclosure form for electoral expenditure, and then in your records that you're keeping outside of the disclosure form, you just need to record the value of that expense so that you can keep a proper tally of how much you're spending that's subject to your cap. So on our website as well, we have detailed information about the rules that apply to the expenditure caps. If you're from a political party, so if we have some people joining tonight who work for political parties, parties don't have expenditure caps in their own right. So at local government elections, any expenditure incurred by political parties for the party's endorsed candidates and groups has to be aggregated with the candidates and groups' expenditure and must in aggregate be within the applicable cap for that candidate or group. So fundraising, yes, candidates, groups, parties can do fundraisers, can raise funds for the election. The tickets that you sell, auction items and other items are all donations which have to be disclosed and accounted for, and any expenses that you incur to put the fundraiser on has to be properly recorded as well, paid for from the campaign account and properly disclosed as well. It's worth noting that expenditure that you incur on your fundraising events is not subject to the expenditure caps, so that is one exemption from the caps. And in addition to keeping records of your fundraising donations and expenditure, you need to work out for each fundraiser that you have the net or gross proceeds for the event and a description of the event and the date or period in which their fundraiser was held, because those things have to be disclosed. So let's just go through the steps there of what to do when you incur electoral expenditure. So just a reminder, a candidate or group must be registered before payments for electoral expenditure are made, and payment has to be made from the campaign account unless it's a minor payment of an expense. Keep a complete and accurate record of all of your expenditure. Keep copies of your invoices and receipts because they need to be provided with your disclosure form, and make sure you keep copies of any advertising or printed electoral material because they also need to be submitted with your disclosure form. And we've got a question here around bank accounts. Given that a candidate has their own bank account and the political party has their own bank account, which account does the candidate use for the campaign? So if the candidate wants to incur their own electoral expenditure, either using their own funds or raise money, receive donations, then they can spend money on their campaign. In addition to that, or separate, or instead of that, the political party that endorsed that candidate can also incur electoral expenditure to promote that candidate, and that would have to be paid for through the party's account. So there is electoral expenditure of a candidate, and that is expenditure that you incur yourself for your campaign. Then there's expenditure of the party, which is dealt with separately by the party. So disclosing political donations and electoral expenditure. So as I've been saying throughout this evening, all political donations and electoral expenditure have to be disclosed to the New South Wales Electoral Commission. And at the moment, disclosures are made using what we call a declaration form, which has to be signed and submitted by the deadline by the person who's legally responsible. And just going back to what I covered earlier tonight, if you're a candidate, you're responsible for signing and submitting your own disclosure forms. And if you're the lead candidate of a group, you also have to sign and submit a disclosure form on behalf of the group, which is separate to the disclosure form you lodge as a candidate. So with funding and disclosure online becoming available in June, for the reporting period ending 30 June this year, this is the first period in which disclosures can now be made online using funding and disclosure online. So when funding and disclosure online becomes available in June, you can, if you want to use it, you set up your access. That's the first step. You need to verify your identity as part of that process, and then you can start to enter the donations and expenditure that you need to disclose. And then in July, when it's time to submit those disclosures, we will give you access to being able to electronically sign and submit those disclosures to us. So that's instead of having to go to our website, download a PDF form, fill it in, sign it, send it to us. And the way that we've built funding and disclosure online, we're hoping to have made it easy enough for candidates to fill in the details, parties to fill in the details of their donations and expenditure, reduce the occurrences of particular errors around making disclosures, say people who may have left things out, left parts of the disclosure blank in the past, they'll be asked to fill in those mandatory pieces of information. Some of you may have experienced in the past where someone submitted a disclosure form for you and then we came back to you to say, no, the wrong person has signed that form. So in Funding and Disclosure Online, that has all been set up for everybody. You can only electronically sign and submit the forms that you're legally responsible for. We've just got a question about the online platform, which is, will it allow us to record donations and expenditure made before the platform became live? Yes, you can. So if it was in this current financial year, if the donations and expenditure incurred in this financial year, once you have access to the portal, you can go in and create a disclosure. So I think the button is called Start a New Disclosure from memory, and you can start entering the details of your donations and expenditure. And then from 1 July, you can review what you've entered and then electronically sign and submit the form. Now we do publish the disclosures on our website, and if you're interested in seeing what disclosures people have lodged for previous years, or say that they will be lodging in July for the current financial year, you can go onto our website as and when those disclosures are published and have a look and see what people disclosed. So there's different types of disclosures that you'll need to do. One of them is the half-yearly disclosure form for political donations made and received. And I've mentioned a few times tonight, there's a disclosure form for the half-yearly period for political donations. That covers the 6-month period, either 1 July to 31 December or 1 January to 30 June. And in those forms you disclose the political donations you've received, the political donations you've made, and if you're a candidate, you can disclose any amounts you've paid into your campaign account as well. Now, for those of you who are already registered or who register before the 1st of July, you'll need to do your half-yearly political donation disclosure form and submit that in July. It's due on the 28th of July this year. So just be mindful, if you are already registered or you're thinking of applying to be registered before 30 June, then you will have to do a disclosure in July. And we also have the annual disclosure of electoral expenditure. So that's due, that covers the period 1 July to 30 June, and those disclosures are due on the 22nd of September. So look, we understand the election, it's right in the midst of the election. You're all going to be very busy, you'll all be focused on your campaigns. But just try and remember that you'll have your July disclosure to lodge, your September disclosure to lodge if you're already registered, or if you're a current councillor or mayor, you'll have to lodge your elected member disclosures during the midst of the election. So try and lodge them as early as possible if you can, get them out of the way, and then you'll be able to focus on your campaign. So, and for this election, all candidates and groups will have to continue to submit disclosures up until September of next year. So that's because this election is held in the 2021-22 financial year. So all candidates and groups have to make disclosures for the full financial year, which means next July will be the last half-yearly disclosure for donations, and September of next year will be the last disclosure for electoral expenditure. So just be mindful that once everything's done and dusted for the election, some of you may not get the result that you want and may not be elected, but nevertheless you still have these disclosure obligations that continue on. If you have nothing to disclose for a period, so I've received no donations, I've spent no money, I've made no donations, you can submit what we call a nil disclosure. And I can tell you, if you are curious about funding and disclosure online and you have nothing to disclose, the process to submit a nil disclosure is a lot easier than the current process with our PDF forms. So if you think that might apply to you, that could be some incentive for you to set up your access to funding and disclosure online. So while you can start entering your donations and expenditure in funding and disclosure online from the time it becomes live in June, if you are going to use one of the forms on our website, we won't make those forms available until the 1st of July. So you will need to wait until then before you can download those forms and start filling them in. And just remember, it's an offence not to submit a valid disclosure by the due date. So be mindful of that because there are penalties that can be imposed for not lodging a disclosure form. And that includes using the incorrect form, which won't happen if you're using funding and disclosure online. But if you are downloading forms from the website, be mindful to use the correct form that we spell out to you when we write to you about your obligations, because you'll need to submit the correct form. It has to be signed and completed by the person who's legally responsible. So we've talked about that. That's the candidate or the lead candidate, and it has to be lodged by the due date. So that's it for covering off the donations and expenditure content. I just wanted to talk to you now around how we deal with allegations and offences. Some of you no doubt will come across some scenarios where you think that seems unlawful. Is that person doing the right thing? Are they breaking the rules? So just a reminder for yourself as well that a lot of these rules do have offences attached to them, so you need to make sure you're understanding the rules and complying with them, because you can get yourself into some difficulty if you're not complying with those rules. We can issue warnings, fines, we can prosecute people depending on the severity of the offence and other factors. So all of those things we do monitor, and we can take enforcement action according to our compliance and enforcement policies. So some examples of some offences that you might be mindful of or you might see is where people aren't using a campaign account or not using it according to the rules. Excuse me. So definitely laws around the campaign account and breaches, accepting donations unlawfully. So if a donor is not a lawful donor, might be a prohibited donor, could be a donation in excess of the donation caps. All of those things are potential breaches of the law. Incurring expenditure unlawfully, it's mainly around not paying for your expenditure from a campaign account and breaching the expenditure caps. Failing to keep complete and accurate records. So the record keeping is really important, and you need to make sure that you're keeping proper records of everything you receive and spend. And also failing to comply with the disclosure requirements, as I discussed just a minute ago. So if you did want to make an allegation to us about someone that you think might be acting or have done something unlawfully, we accept allegations in writing, and try and provide as much information and detail as you can with your allegation, and provide any evidence, which can include photos or anything else that you might have that supports your allegation. We can't comment on the status of a review or an investigation that we're conducting, but certainly we do accept those allegations and we do look into them in accordance with our compliance and enforcement policies, which you can find those policies on our website if you're interested in having a look at them. So just wrapping up tonight's webinar, and make sure if you've got some questions, now's the time to shoot them through because these are the last few slides. So if you're looking for resources that we have, the main place to go is our website. Lots of information on our website about all of the funding and disclosure rules. We have our registration and disclosure forms, as I've talked about this evening. We'll have links to funding and disclosure online from June. And I really do encourage you to get on and set up your access to funding and disclosure online. It's a fabulous new tool for people to use that will make it a lot easier for you to meet your obligations. The public register of candidates that lists all of the registered candidates, that's on our website now. You can have a look at that. We've got fact sheets about a range of things, including the caps on the caps on electoral expenditure, I should say, and all of the rules around those. We've got some FAQs on our website as well. That's a new feature on our website. So we'll be building on those FAQs over the coming months. And if you've got questions for us that we think are valuable to a wide range of candidates, then we can put those up on our website as FAQs. Also make sure you go and check out our election calendar for the key dates for the election. And also we've got the 6 steps for being a candidate, which you might have seen before the webinar started on your screen. The 6 steps basically takes you through the different things that you have to do to successfully be a candidate for the election. So we've just got a question here that I'll look at. Existing councillors may already have been fundraising. 1, do they have to register as a candidate? No, current councillors and mayors do not need to register as a candidate, but they can if they want to. And B, can they use those funds for campaigning? Yes, they can. If they're raising funds for their own re-election as a candidate, they can use those funds to incur expenditure for their own re-election. That's fine. We have another question now. Do members of a group need to register as individuals as well as in the group if not collecting money other than through the group? No, but the registration form that we have on our website and in funding and disclosure online is set up so that the candidates who are in the group are registered at the same time as the group. So no, they don't if they're not going to be receiving or spending money, but they will be registered as part of that group registration process. Just another question here. Are expenses incurred refunded or partially refunded if a candidate is elected? No, not for local government elections. There is no public funding available to candidates and parties at local government elections, so no. Just on the screen here, we've got details about upcoming webinars that we've got. So the first one, there's the one this evening. On the 10th and the 15th of June, it's a repeated, the 15th is repeated webinar of the 10th. That is again covering general information that applies at this election. So the main focus of the June webinars will be around the COVID safety measures that the Electoral Commission will be putting in place for the election to keep everybody safe. It will also have a large focus on the rules that apply to electoral material, and will go into quite a bit of detail around the counting of the votes and the publication of the election results. So there will be lots of useful information in the June webinars. On the 1st of July, we'll have a webinar with detailed information around using the nominations online management system, which is the online system that's been developed for candidate nominations. It's a separate system to funding and disclosure online, but you can submit your nomination forms for the first time for local government elections using an online system rather than a paper form. And then we'll have further webinars as we get closer to the election, covering the rules around electoral material and early voting and voting on election day. So we have another question here. Is there a limit as to how much a candidate can raise in total in funding? No, there isn't. As long as each donor is only giving you up to the donation cap amount for the financial year, you can raise as much money as you want. Your only limit is how much you can spend, because what you spend is subject to an expenditure cap. So if you've got money left over at the end of the election, you can't actually keep it or profit from it. You have to disperse the funds that you have left over in accordance with the rules. So we've got information on our website about what those rules are, and we will be emailing all candidates after the election to say, look, election's now over. If you've got money left over in your account, once you've paid all your bills, this is what you do with those leftover funds. Another question, if you design and pay for a call flute poster now, but it's not delivered until the 1st of July, does it come within the cap? Yes, it does. If you are displaying the poster in the capped expenditure period, so from 1 July to election day, then anything that you do to design or produce that poster is subject to the expenditure cap. All right, now's your last call for questions. We've got another question here. If one campaign account for the group, so if you have one campaign account for the group, does that mean each candidate has to fill out forms for disclosure and expenditure, or is it just the lead candidate? Yes, it does mean each candidate in the group has to do their own disclosure forms, even if they have nothing to disclose because they've received nothing and spent nothing. Every candidate in a group has to submit their own disclosures, including the lead candidate, and then the lead candidate will also submit disclosure forms for the group themselves, the group entity. Another question here, I thought there was a cap on total group funds. Again, no, there isn't. I mean, a group can accept as much as it can raise in political donations, but the donations are subject to the donation caps. So the group can only accept up to a certain amount from each donor in the financial year. And of course, the group can only spend a certain amount on the election because the expenditure is subject to an expenditure cap. Another question, so for political parties, does the official agent handle the funding and disclosure forms and campaign bank account? So I think this person might mean, does the party agent, not the official agent, the party agent of the party. So for those of you who aren't aware, the party agent's the person who submits disclosure forms for a political party. And yes, the party agent is responsible for the party's disclosure forms. So every single party must submit disclosure forms, and the party agent is responsible for that. The lead candidate of every group must submit disclosure forms, and every single candidate must submit their own disclosure forms. Another question, liquor, gambling, tobacco, that doesn't mean people who work in the retail space selling those goods and services, does it? It's like an exec from the companies. So that's where you're talking about a close associate, staff of a liquor or gambling or tobacco entity, prohibited donors. Well, they only are if they're what we call a close associate. That would mean they'd have to be a director of that company or the spouse of a director or some other types of close associates. But otherwise, generally, staff are not included as close associates. Does the expenditure cap apply to each candidate or the group and the party? So if you're in a group, the expenditure cap applies to the group. So all expenditure incurred by the candidates in the group and the group itself all come under a single expenditure cap. So if the expenditure cap for a group is $10,000, then in total, in the capped expenditure period, the candidates in that group and the group itself can only spend $10,000. Now, if the group is endorsed by a party and the party wants to spend its own money to promote that group, then anything the party spends also has to be aggregated with whatever the group and candidate and group members are spending, and all has to be within that $10,000 amount. The $10,000 is just an example. You need to go onto the website to see what the amount is for your area and ward. We've just got a few minutes left. I'll try and get through as many questions as I can. Does only a lead candidate of a group need to do a disclosure? Or are all members in the group required to provide a disclosure? Yes, all members of the group have to do a disclosure, including the lead candidate, and then the lead candidate will also submit a group disclosure form. Now, just going back to the screen there, look, if you've got questions after tonight, there's our 1300 number. Please call us during office hours. We're happy to take your call. If you've got email questions that you want to send through about the content tonight, send them through to fdc@elections.nsw.gov.au. That's the funding and disclosure team. So funding and disclosure questions to that email address, or you can go onto our website. And I do want to add that after tonight, maybe tomorrow or in a couple of days, we'll send you an email and we'll ask you to please give us some feedback on tonight's webinar. We really do value your feedback, and so if you could spend a couple of minutes, we only just have a few questions to ask in our online survey, and we would really be grateful if you could click on that link in the email and complete the survey for us. All right, we've got a couple more questions. So can a local political party branch donate to candidates? Yes, a party can donate to its candidates, but it must be mindful of the donation cap rules. So, and just remember that rule, the aggregation rule around candidates and groups of the same party. So if a party wants to donate to more than one of its candidates or groups, it needs to be mindful of that aggregation rule. So any more questions for tonight? We have one here around the nomination fee. Is the nomination fee counted as an expense and included in the $1,000 expenditure threshold? No, it's not. The nomination, it's a deposit actually. You get that deposit back if you are elected or get a certain proportion of the votes. You don't need to disclose that as electoral expenditure, and it doesn't come under the expenditure cap amount, or it doesn't count towards the campaign account threshold. So if there's no more questions for tonight, then I think we might wrap up the webinar. Thanks everyone for joining in tonight and for all of your questions. They were really great. I hope you've learnt quite a few things from the webinar tonight and can take this information forward into planning and running your campaign. And of course, come to us if you've got further questions or you need clarification on what I discussed tonight. So thank you everyone, and enjoy your evening.